Picture this. The year is 1992. A man walks into his local barber shop in Bentonville, Arkansas. He's wearing his usual outfit, a worn trucker's cap, some budget khakis, and a plain button-down shirt that's seen better days. He sits down, chats with the barber about the weather, about the Razorbacks, about nothing in particular. He pays for his haircut with exact change, maybe leaves a modest tip, and walks back out to his 1979 Ford pickup truck. The whole visit cost him about $6. Nothing unusual about this scene, right? Except that this man, this guy in the beat-up cap getting a $6 haircut, is worth somewhere north of $23 billion. His name is Sam Walton, and he owns Walmart. And just a few blocks away from that barbershop sits his house. Not his mansion, not his estate, not his compound. His house. A modest, unassuming, almost aggressively normal house on a quiet street where the property value is less than what he makes in the time it takes him to sneeze. Now, that's not the tragic part. Not yet. The tragedy isn't about the money, or even really about the house itself. The tragedy is about what that house represents, what it cost beyond dollars and cents, and what happened when the man who refused to leave it behind finally had no choice but to do exactly that. This is a story about the American dream, sure, but it's also about the price of obsession, about the weight of legacy, and about how the choices we make in the name of staying true to ourselves can sometimes destroy the very things we're trying to protect. So let's go back to the beginning, because you can't understand the house without understanding the man, and you can't understand the man without understanding where he came from. Samuel Moore. Walton was born in 1918 in Kingfisher, Oklahoma, right in the teeth of the Dust Bowl era. His father, Thomas Walton, was a farmer who struggled constantly, moving the family from town to town, job to job, always chasing the next opportunity that never quite materialized. Young Sam learned early what it meant to be poor, really poor, the kind of poor where you're not sure if there'll be food on the table tomorrow. His mother, Nancy, took in sewing work to help make ends meet. Sam would later say that watching his mother work herself to exhaustion night after night, her fingers bleeding from needle pricks, her eyes straining in dim lamplight, was what taught him the value of $1. But here's the thing about Sam. He didn't just learn the value of $1, he became obsessed with it. Not in the way most people think about when they picture greedy businessmen. Sam wasn't interested in luxury or status symbols. He was interested in never, ever feeling that particular flavor of helplessness again. The kind that comes from not having control over your own survival. By the time he was in high school, Sam was delivering newspapers, selling magazine subscriptions, doing whatever odd jobs he could find. He was good at it too, really good. He had this natural ability to connect with people, to make them like him, to convince them that they needed whatever he was selling. When he went to the University of Missouri, he worked his way through, graduating in 1940 with a degree in economics. The Depression was still casting its long shadow, and jobs were scarce, but Sam landed a position as a management trainee at J.C. Penney in Des Moines, Iowa. He made $75 a month. Then came World War II. Sam joined the Army, served stateside supervising security at aircraft plants and prisoner of war camps. He married Helen Robson in 1943, a woman from a well-off family who owned a ranch and a bank. Now, you might think this is where Sam's money came from, where he got his start, and you'd be partially right. Helen's father, L.S. Robson, would later lend Sam $20,000 to help him buy his first store. But that came later. First, there was the small matter of Sam figuring out what he actually wanted to do with his life. After the war, in 1945, Sam borrowed $5,000 from his father-in-law and used it as a down payment to purchase a Ben Franklin variety store franchise in Newport, Arkansas. A variety store, if you're not familiar, was basically the precursor to the modern discount store, selling everything from thread to toys to tools, all under one roof. Sam was 27 years old. This was it. This was his shot, and he attacked it like a man possessed. He worked 7 days a week, open to close, and then some. He'd be at the store before dawn stocking shelves, and he'd be there long after dark doing the books. He studied every aspect of the business, became almost fanatical about cutting costs and improving efficiency. He'd drive hundreds of miles to other stores to see what they were doing, what was working, what wasn't. He started buying directly from manufacturers instead of using wholesalers, cutting out the middleman to save pennies on each item. Those pennies added up. And it worked. Within 5 years, his little Ben Franklin store in Newport was the most profitable in the entire 6-state region. Sam was making good money, really good money for the first time in his life. But then something happened that would shape everything that came after. In 1950, the landlord who owned the building where Sam's store was located refused to renew his lease. The landlord's son wanted the location for his own business. And just like that, despite all of Sam's success, despite everything he'd built, he had to walk away. He had to leave behind the store, the customers, the business he'd spent 5 years building from nothing. That moment, that feeling of loss, of having something taken from him through no fault of his own, it carved something deep into Sam Walton's psyche. He vowed it would never happen again. He would never again be at the mercy of someone else's decisions. Control. That's what he needed, complete and total control. So Sam took the money he'd made, and in 1950, he bought a store in Bentonville, Arkansas. Bentonville, population about 3,000 at the time, a small town in the northwest corner of the state, surrounded by chicken farms and apple orchards. It wasn't much, but the building was his. He called it Walton's 5 and Dime. Helen wasn't thrilled about the move. She'd grown up in Oklahoma in a more refined setting, and Bentonville was, to put it gently, rustic. But Sam had made his choice, and Helen, to her credit, supported him. Now, here's where the house comes in. When the Waltons moved to Bentonville in 1950, they needed a place to live. They had 4 kids by this point, Rob, John, Jim, and Alice, and they needed space. But Sam, being Sam, wasn't about to go buy some grand estate or build a showpiece property. Instead, he bought a modest brick house on a quiet street. The house was nice enough, well-built, solid, respectable. It had a living room, a dining room, a decent kitchen, bedrooms for the kids. Nothing fancy, but comfortable. It was the kind of house a successful small-town merchant would own. And that's exactly what Sam was. The house sat on a normal lot, had a small yard, trees out front. The address was on Southeast 5th Street, right in a regular neighborhood where doctors and lawyers and business owners lived. Middle-class prosperity, the American dream in brick and mortar, and for the Walton family in 1950, it was perfect. It was theirs. It was paid for. It was home. But here's the thing, and this is important to understand. Sam Walton never intended to stay small-time. Even as he was settling into that house, even as Helen was hanging curtains and planting flowers, Sam was already dreaming bigger. He opened a second store in Fayetteville, then another in Kansas, then more. Throughout the 1950s, he built a small chain of Ben Franklin franchises, each one running on his formula of low prices, high volume, operational efficiency. He was learning, always refining his methods, and the whole time he lived in that house in Bentonville. As his business grew, as he opened more stores, as his income increased, Sam stayed put. Helen would occasionally suggest maybe they should build something bigger, something more appropriate to their growing success. Sam would brush it off. Why? The house worked fine. Why spend money they didn't need to spend? See, what was happening is that Sam's philosophy about business was bleeding into every aspect of his life. In his stores, he obsessed over every penny. He'd negotiate with suppliers until they thought he'd gone mad, fighting over fractions of a cent per unit. He'd turn off lights in empty rooms, adjust thermostats to save on heating and cooling, buy used fixtures instead of new ones. Every dollar saved was a dollar that could go into opening another store, into lowering prices to undercut competitors, into growing the empire, and he applied that same logic at home. The house was paid for, it functioned perfectly well, therefore any money spent on a new house would be wasted money that could be better used elsewhere. It was perfectly rational, at least from Sam's perspective, but it was also the beginning of something else, something that would eventually take on a life of its own. By 1962, Sam Walton was running 16 variety stores across Arkansas, Missouri, and Kansas. He was successful by any measure. He was wealthy, certainly wealthier than 99% of the people in Bentonville, but he'd also hit a ceiling. The variety store model had limitations. The downtown locations, the small storefronts, the franchise restrictions, all of it was holding him back. And Sam, remember, couldn't stand being held back. That's when he had his big idea. He'd been watching what was happening in retail, studying the discount department store concept that was starting to emerge. Stores like Kmart and Target were opening in big cities, offering a wide selection of goods at discount prices in large format stores. Sam thought, why not bring that concept to small towns? Everyone said it wouldn't work, that small towns couldn't support such stores, that the population density wasn't there. Sam thought they were all wrong. On July 2nd, 1962, Sam Walton opened the first Walmart in Rogers, Arkansas, just a few miles from Bentonville. Walmart Discount City, he called it. 16,000 square feet of retail space offering everything from apparel to appliances at prices lower than anyone else. The grand opening was by all accounts chaotic. Sam had bought the cheapest fixtures he could find, actual second-hand equipment from a failed store. Merchandise was piled on tables. The store was hot because Sam didn't want to run the air conditioning full blast, and some of the goods were displayed in their original shipping boxes because Sam hadn't wanted to buy fancy shelving. But it worked. People came. They bought. They came back. And Sam was off to the races. He opened a second Walmart in 1964. Then more and more. All through the 1960s, the chain grew. 5 stores, 10 stores, 20. And every single one of them ran on Sam's principles. Keep costs low, pass savings to customers, sell volume, reinvest profits into growth. And through all of this, through every store opening, through every new market, through every $1 million milestone, Sam Walton kept living in that same house in Bentonville. The house that by the late 1960s was looking increasingly out of place compared to his success. His neighbors were doctors and pharmacists and shop owners. And here was Sam Walton, whose company was starting to generate millions in revenue, living in basically the same square footage as a middle manager. People started to talk. Not meanly. Exactly, but curiously. Why doesn't Sam build a bigger house? He can certainly afford it. What's he waiting for? Is he really that cheap? Helen would smile politely when people asked, make some comment about preferring the neighborhood, about not wanting to disrupt the children's lives. But the truth was more complex. For Sam, the house had become a symbol. It represented something important to him, something about staying grounded, about remembering where he came from, about not losing himself to materialism and ego. He'd seen other successful businessmen build massive mansions, buy yachts, drape themselves in expensive clothes and jewelry, and then lose focus on their businesses. Sam was convinced that the moment he started living like a rich man, he'd start thinking like one, and that would be the beginning of the end. The house, that modest brick house on 5th Street, was his anchor. It kept him humble. It kept him hungry. But it was also becoming something else. It was becoming a prison. By the 1970s, Walmart was exploding. The company went public in 1970, and suddenly, Sam wasn't just wealthy, he was capital W wealthy. The stock took off. The stores kept multiplying. 30 stores, 50, 100. Each one carefully placed in small towns that big retailers ignored, each one staffed with people Sam personally trained in his methods, each one a testament to his vision. The company broke $100 million in annual sales, then it hit $1 billion, then $5 billion. And Sam still lived in the house, the same house. Now it wasn't just quaint or quirky, it was starting to seem almost perverse. Here was a man who was rapidly becoming one of the richest people in America, and he was living like an upper-middle-class school principal. He drove that same old pickup truck. He got the same $6 haircuts. He wore the same plain clothes. He lived in the same house. Helen had long since stopped suggesting they move. She knew it was pointless. The house had become part of Sam's identity, part of his mythology. He'd tell reporters about it, use it as proof that he was still just a regular guy, that success hadn't changed him. And maybe at first that had been true. But somewhere along the way, it had stopped being a choice and started being a compulsion. Sam couldn't move out of the house, because moving out of the house would mean admitting that he'd changed, that he wasn't the same scrappy kid from the Depression who'd worked his way up from nothing. The house was evidence of his virtue, his discipline, his authenticity. But there was a cost. There's always a cost. The house that was supposed to keep Sam grounded, that was supposed to remind him of what was important. It started to do the opposite. It became an excuse. Sam could work 18-hour days, 7 days a week, could miss family dinners and school events and birthdays and anniversaries, could essentially abandon his family emotionally, and he could justify it. Because look, he wasn't some fat cat living in a mansion. He was still in the same house. He was still humble. He was still one of the people. The house gave him permission to be obsessed. His kids grew up in that house, but they didn't really grow up with their father. Sam was always at the office or visiting stores or planning expansions. Helen raised the children essentially as a single mother, despite being married to one of the richest men in the country. The kids would later say that they understood, that they knew their father was building something important, but you can hear the pain underneath those words. They wanted their dad. They got a driven businessman who happened to sleep in the same house a few hours each night. And Helen paid her own price. She'd given up her own dreams, her own ambitions, to support Sam's vision. She'd moved to Bentonville when she didn't want to. She'd stayed in the house when she would have preferred something more comfortable, more appropriate to their station. She'd raised 4 children largely alone. She'd smiled and hosted and played the role of the successful businessman's wife, all while living in a house that was starting to feel like a statement she wasn't sure she agreed with anymore. But the Waltons were nothing if not disciplined. They didn't complain publicly. They didn't air grievances. They maintained the image. Sam Walton, the humble billionaire in his modest home, the man who'd stayed true to his roots, the walking embodiment of American values. By the 1980s, Walmart was a juggernaut. 500 stores, 1,000. The company was revolutionizing retail, destroying competitors, changing the economic landscape of small-town America. Sam Walton was regularly appearing on the Forbes list of the richest Americans, often in the top spot. His net worth was measured in the billions, plural. He could have bought literally any house in the world. He could have built a palace. Instead, he stayed in Bentonville, in the house, that same house he'd bought in 1950. The town was changing around him. Bentonville, which had been this sleepy little place with 3,000 people when the Waltons arrived, was growing. Walmart's headquarters was there, and that meant jobs, lots of them. People were moving in. New developments were springing up, and some of those developments were pretty upscale. Big houses on big lots for the Walmart executives who were getting rich from stock options. Ironic, isn't it? The employees Sam had made wealthy were building the kinds of houses he refused to build for himself. There's this story, probably apocryphal, but it illustrates the point, about a Walmart executive who built this beautiful large home on several acres outside Bentonville. Nice place, stone and glass, professionally landscaped, the works. Sam supposedly drove out there, looked it over, and told the guy he was disappointed, said he didn't understand why anyone needed that much house. The executive, to his credit, apparently replied that he'd learned from Sam's example that you should reinvest in what you value. He valued his family time, his comfort, his ability to host and entertain. So he had invested in his home. Sam didn't have much to say to that. What could he say? Because the truth was starting to become unavoidable. Sam didn't value those things. Or maybe he did, but he valued control more. He valued growth more. He valued winning more. The house wasn't really about humility or staying grounded. It was about control. It was about proving something. But proving what? And to whom? In 1985, Forbes officially named Sam Walton the richest man in America. His fortune was estimated at around $28 billion. He was 77 years old. Most men his age were retired, spending time with grandchildren, traveling, relaxing. Sam was still putting in 6-day weeks at the office, still visiting stores, still obsessing over cost reductions and expansion plans, still living in the house. But time, as they say, comes for everyone. In 1989, Sam was diagnosed with bone cancer, multiple myeloma, an incurable form. The prognosis wasn't good, maybe a few years with treatment, maybe less. This was it. This was the thing he couldn't control, couldn't negotiate with, couldn't outwork. Death was coming, and all the billions in the world couldn't stop it. Now, you might think this is where the story turns, where Sam realizes what he's given up, where he has some grand revelation about what really matters. And maybe he did, in private moments. But publicly, Sam Walton did what Sam Walton always did. He worked. He kept going to the office. He kept visiting stores. He fought the cancer with the same grim determination he'd applied to business, seeing it as just another challenge to overcome through sheer force of will. And he stayed in the house. Even as his health declined, even as he needed more medical care, even as it would have made practical sense to move somewhere more accommodating to his condition, Sam stayed in the house. It would be years, his last years, and he spent them in the same home he'd bought 40 years earlier. Some people called it admirable. Some called it stubborn. Some probably called it tragic. The truth is, it was all of those things. Sam Walton had built an empire, had changed American retail forever, had created wealth beyond imagination, and he'd done it all while living in a house that wouldn't look out of place in a middle-class suburb. And that was the point. That was always the point. The house was the evidence that he hadn't sold out, that he'd stayed true to his principles. But those principles had cost him his family time, his relaxation, his ability to enjoy what he'd built. The house that was supposed to prove he hadn't changed had actually enabled him to change in worse ways, to become so consumed by work that nothing else mattered. Sam Walton died on April 5, 1992. He was 74 years old. President George H.W. Bush awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom just weeks before his death, recognizing his contributions to American business and society. The funeral was held in Bentonville, and it seemed like the entire town showed up. Thousands of people lined the streets. Walmart stores across the country closed for a moment of silence. The man who'd built an empire from a 5 and dime store, who'd never forgotten his roots, who'd stayed in his modest house until the very end, was gone. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. Here's where the tragedy becomes fully apparent, because after Sam died, after the funeral and the mourning and the tributes, his family had to figure out what to do with the house, and they were faced with an impossible situation. The house had been Sam's symbol, his statement, his identity, but it was also just a house. An old house that needed repairs, that was outdated, that didn't meet the needs of a modern family. None of the kids wanted to live in it. They all had their own homes, their own lives. Helen was in her 70s, and while she'd spent over 40 years in that house, she didn't have the same emotional attachment to it that Sam had. For her, it had been a compromise, a sacrifice. So what do you do with a house like that? You can't just sell it. Not really. It's part of the Walmart story, part of the Sam Walton legend. But you can't turn it into a shrine either, because that would be weird and antithetical to everything Sam supposedly stood for. The house existed in this strange liminal space, too important to dispose of, too ordinary to preserve. For a while, Helen stayed in the house, but it was hard. Every room held memories, some good, many tinged with the sadness of opportunities missed, of family moments that could have been but weren't because Sam was always working. The house had been the scene of countless silent dinners, where Sam was present physically, but absent mentally. His mind at the office, at the stores, always at work. It had been the place where kids waited for a father who was usually late or not coming at all. It had been the manifestation of a philosophy that valued business success over personal connection. Eventually, Helen moved out. She bought a different house, still in Bentonville because she'd built a life there, but a newer place, something more comfortable for her later years. The old house on 5th Street sat mostly empty. The family couldn't quite bring themselves to sell it to strangers, to let some other family move in and paint over Sam's legacy. But they also couldn't figure out what else to do with it. And this is the tragedy, you see. Sam Walton had stayed in that house his entire adult life to prove a point about humility and authenticity. But after he was gone, the house revealed itself for what it had really been, a symbol of his obsession, of his inability to let go, of his fear that admitting he was wealthy would somehow corrupt him or invalidate his accomplishments. The house hadn't kept him grounded. It had kept him trapped. And now it sat there, empty, a monument to the price of that obsession. The Walton family, to their credit, tried to figure it out. They were now collectively one of the richest families in the world, with each of Sam's 4 children and Helen inheriting massive stakes in Walmart. The company continued to grow after Sam's death, becoming even larger and more dominant. The Waltons became synonymous with American wealth, and all of them lived in nice houses, appropriate to their means. All of them, except the memory of Sam, still tied to that modest brick house in Bentonville. In the years after Sam's death, Bentonville continued to transform. Walmart kept growing, and the town grew with it. The population exploded. What had been a small town of a few thousand became a booming city of tens of thousands. Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art was built there by Alice Walton, Sam's daughter, a world-class art museum in the middle of Arkansas. The downtown revitalized, property values soared, and Sam's old house, sitting on its small lot on 5th Street, became even more of an anomaly. There were discussions about what to do with it. Some suggested turning it into a museum, a place where people could tour and learn about Sam Walton's life and philosophy. But the family resisted. Sam had hated pretension, had refused to put himself on a pedestal. Making his house into a museum felt wrong, felt like the opposite of everything he'd stood for. Others suggested maybe donating it to the city, letting them figure it out. But that felt like abdicating responsibility. This was their father's house, their childhood home. It meant something, even if they couldn't quite articulate what. For years, the house existed in this strange state of preservation. The family kept it maintained, kept the lawn mowed, kept it from falling into disrepair. But it wasn't really lived in, wasn't really used. It was like a time capsule, frozen in the moment of Sam's death, unable to move forward but too significant to let go. And here's what makes this truly tragic. Sam Walton's refusal to move out of that house, his insistence on living modestly despite his wealth, had been meant to send a message about values and priorities. But the message that actually came through, the message that became clear in the years after his death, was different. The message was that Sam Walton had been so focused on building his business, so committed to his principles of frugality and efficiency, that he'd sacrificed the things that actually matter. He'd sacrificed time with his family. He'd sacrificed simple pleasures and comforts. He'd sacrificed the ability to enjoy what he'd built, all to stay in a house that proved he hadn't been corrupted by wealth, even as that very commitment corrupted his relationships and his life. His children, when they talked about their father in interviews, were always respectful, always admiring. But if you read between the lines, if you listen carefully, you can hear the loss. Rob Walton, the oldest, who ended up running Walmart as chairman for years, once said something in an interview that stuck with me. He said his father was a great man and a great businessman, but that he wished he'd known him better as a person. Think about that. Your father builds one of the most successful companies in history, becomes one of the richest men in the world, and what you wish is that you'd known him better. Jim Walton, another son, focused his life largely on banking and his own business interests, separate from Walmart. When asked about his father, he's always complimentary, but there's a distance there, an emotional space that never quite got filled. Alice Walton, the only daughter, threw herself into art and philanthropy, building that incredible museum in Bentonville. It's beautiful, world-class, everything her father's house was not. Is that a statement? A response? A way of doing things differently? And John Walton, the second son, probably suffered the most visible consequences of the family dynamic. He served in Vietnam, came back decorated and struggling. He tried various business ventures, never quite finding his place. He was killed in a plane crash in 2005, flying an experimental aircraft he'd built himself. A risk taker, a searcher, maybe someone trying to prove something or escape something. You can't help but wonder what growing up in that house, with that father, with that weight of expectation and absence, did to shape these lives. Helen lived until 2007. She was 87 years old. In her later years, she was known for her philanthropy, giving away hundreds of millions of dollars to various causes. She supported education, the arts, community development. She used the wealth Sam had built to try to make the world better. But she also, in quiet ways, lived a life that was different from Sam's. She traveled. She enjoyed nice things. She spent time with her children and grandchildren. It's like she was reclaiming the years she'd given up, the pleasures she'd deferred, the life she'd put on hold while Sam built his empire. After Helen's death, the question of the house became even more pressing. Now, both Sam and Helen were gone. The generation that had lived in the house, that had made it what it was, had passed. What was the point of keeping it now? The Walton family eventually decided to keep ownership of the house, but to use it very selectively. It's not open to the public. It's not a museum. It's maintained as a private property, occasionally used for small family gatherings or Walmart corporate events with historical significance. In other words, it exists, but barely. It's there, but not really there. A ghost of what it represented. And maybe that's the most fitting ending, because the house was always more symbol than substance anyway. It was Sam's way of proving something to himself, to the world. But symbols are tricky things. They can mean what you want them to mean, but they can also take on meanings you never intended. Sam wanted the house to symbolize humility and authenticity, but it ended up symbolizing obsession and sacrifice. The sacrifice of family time, of personal happiness, of the very things that actually make life worth living. There's this moment I think about sometimes. It's from an interview Sam did late in his life, maybe a year or two before the cancer diagnosis. The interviewer asked him if he had any regrets. Sam thought about it for a while, longer than he usually took to answer questions. Finally, he said something like, he wished he'd spent more time with his family when the kids were young. He said it quickly, almost dismissively, like he wanted to acknowledge it, but move on. Then he went right back to talking about business, about store operations, about efficiency metrics. That moment haunts me. Because in that brief pause, in that quick admission, you can see that Sam knew. He knew what he'd given up. He knew what the house had cost, but he also couldn't change. The patterns were too ingrained, the obsession too deep. The house had been his choice, and he'd made his peace with that choice, even if it meant living with regret. Today, if you drive through Bentonville, you can see the house. It's still there on 5th Street, still modest, still unremarkable. The neighborhood around it has changed, gotten more upscale as Bentonville has grown into a real city. But the house itself looks almost exactly like it did when Sam bought it in 1950. There's no plaque, no marker indicating its significance. Most people driving by would have no idea that one of the richest men in American history lived out his entire adult life in that ordinary brick structure. And maybe that's what Sam would have wanted. No fanfare, no monument, just a house. But I can't help thinking about what's been lost, not just for Sam, but for all of us. Because Sam Walton's story gets told as this great American success story. Poor boy makes good, builds empire, stays humble. The house is Exhibit A in that narrative. Look, he never forgot where he came from. Look, he didn't let success change him. But that's not the whole story. The whole story is that Sam Walton was so afraid of being changed by success that he refused to let himself enjoy any of its benefits. The whole story is that he worked himself literally to death, that he missed out on his children's lives, that he turned his home into a symbol rather than a sanctuary. The whole story is tragic in the classical sense, a story of a man brought down by his own virtues taken to extremes. Walmart today is the largest company by revenue in the world. It employs over 2 million people. It has over 11,000 stores in 27 countries. It generates over $600 billion in annual revenue. It's exactly what Sam Walton envisioned and more. His business philosophy of everyday low prices, of operational efficiency, of putting stores in underserved communities, it worked. It changed retail forever. It changed America. But was it worth it? Was building all of that worth the cost to Sam's personal life, to his family, to his own happiness? Sam would probably say yes without hesitation. He lived the life he chose, did things his way, never compromised his principles. And there's something admirable about that, something American about that fierce independence and dedication. But I keep coming back to that house, that ordinary, modest, unremarkable house that Sam Walton refused to leave. And I think about all the extraordinary things that didn't happen in that house, all the family dinners Sam missed, all the bedtime stories he didn't read, all the quiet moments with Helen that he traded for another store opening, another cost analysis, another 18-hour workday. The house was supposed to prove that Sam hadn't been seduced by wealth, that he'd stayed true to himself. But maybe the real truth is that Sam was seduced by something else entirely, by work, by growth, by the need to keep proving himself long after there was anything left to prove. There's a broader lesson here, I think, about American culture and our relationship with success and wealth. We tell stories about people like Sam Walton because we want to believe that you can have it all, that you can build enormous success without sacrificing what matters. We point to the house and say, see, he stayed humble. He didn't change. But that framing lets us avoid the harder question. Should he have changed? Should he have lived in a nicer house, worked fewer hours, spent more time with his family? Would that have made him less authentic, or would it have made him more human? I think about Sam's grandchildren, many of whom are now involved in running the family's various businesses and philanthropies. They grew up with wealth. They live in nice houses. They don't pretend to be anything other than what they are, members of one of America's richest families. And you know what? They seem okay. They seem like decent people trying to use their resources responsibly. None of them are living in modest houses to prove a point. They learned something from Sam's example, maybe, but they also learned from what that example cost. The Walmart Museum in downtown Bentonville has a recreation of Sam's original 5 and dime store. It's well done, historically accurate, interesting to visit, but they don't really talk much about the house. There are pictures of it, mentions of it in the biographical materials, but it's not a centerpiece of the story. I think that's telling, because the house is complicated. It doesn't fit neatly into the hero narrative. It raises questions that are uncomfortable. If Sam Walton had built a mansion, we would have criticized him for it. We would have said he'd forgotten his roots, that wealth had corrupted him, that he'd betrayed his values. But he didn't build a mansion. He stayed in the modest house. And by doing so, he's given us license to ask, at what cost? What did that loyalty to humility actually mean? What did it actually accomplish beyond letting Sam feel good about himself? These are hard questions, and I don't pretend to have definitive answers, but I think they're worth asking. Because Sam Walton's story, and the story of that house in Bentonville, isn't really a story about retail or business or even wealth. It's a story about choices. It's a story about what we prioritize, what we sacrifice, what we tell ourselves to justify those sacrifices. Sam Walton made a choice every single day to stay in that house. And every single day that he made that choice, he was also choosing not to do something else, not to build memories with his family, not to enjoy the fruits of his incredible labor, not to live a life that had some balance, some moderation. The house became his statement to the world, but it was also his prison. And unlike the landlord in Newport who'd forced him out of his first store, this time the only person keeping Sam in that house was Sam himself. In the end, what makes this story truly tragic isn't that Sam Walton lived in a modest house despite being rich. That's just an interesting quirk, an anecdote. What makes it tragic is that the house became a symbol of everything Sam couldn't do, couldn't be, couldn't allow himself. It became the physical manifestation of his limitations, his fears, his obsessions. He could build the world's largest retail empire, but he couldn't build a healthy relationship with his own family. He could revolutionize American business, but he couldn't let himself enjoy a single luxury without feeling like a hypocrite. He could become one of the richest men on earth, but he couldn't escape that Depression-era poverty mindset that told him any comfort was weakness, any pleasure was sin. The house sits there still, maintained but unused, significant but empty. Kind of like Sam's later years in a way. Present but absent, important but disconnected, a symbol searching for meaning in a story that's already been written. And that's the tragedy of Sam Walton's Bentonville house. Not that it was modest, not that it was ordinary, but that it was everything and nothing. Everything Sam thought it needed to be, nothing he actually needed it to be. A monument to principles that, in being held too rigidly, became their own kind of excess. A shrine to humility that was, in its own way, the most extravagant thing Sam Walton ever owned. Because maintaining that humility, performing that modesty every single day for 40-plus years, required more wealth than any mansion ever could. It required the wealth of time, of presence, of connection. And Sam spent all of it. He spent it buying the image of a man unchanged by success. He spent it maintaining the fiction that you can build an empire without becoming different. He spent it on that house. And in the end, the house won. Not Sam, not his family, not even Walmart, really. The house won because it's what people remember, what they talk about, what defines the story. Sam Walton, the billionaire who lived like a millionaire. Wait, that's not right. Sam Walton, the billionaire who lived like 100,000-aire. Still not quite right. Sam Walton, the billionaire who lived like he was still worried about next month's rent, like he was still that kid watching his mother bleed herself for pennies, like he was still that young man who'd lost his store in Newport and vowed never to lose anything again. The house was Sam's way of never losing. If he never upgraded, never changed, never admitted that he'd moved beyond his origins, then he could never have that success taken away. The poverty couldn't catch him if he never really left it behind. But you can't live like that. You can't spend your whole life running from a past that's long gone. Or you can, but this is what it costs. This is what it looks like. An empty house in Bentonville, a symbol without a meaning, a monument to a man who never let himself become who he actually was. So when people talk about Sam Walton's house, when they mention it as evidence of his virtue and his values, I hope they'll think about the rest of the story too. I hope they'll think about Helen hanging curtains in a house she didn't really want. I hope they'll think about 4 kids growing up with an absent father who was home every night but never really there. I hope they'll think about a man who conquered the business world but couldn't conquer his own fears. And I hope they'll ask themselves, if this is success, if this is the American dream, is it worth it? Is the house worth what it cost? I don't know. Maybe it was for Sam. Maybe he died content, satisfied that he'd lived according to his principles, that he'd never betrayed his values, that he'd stayed in the house until the end. But I think about that interview, that pause, that quick admission of regret, and I think Sam knew, in those quiet moments, in the dark hours when he couldn't sleep, when he was alone in that house with his thoughts, I think Sam Walton knew exactly what he'd traded, and I think he wondered maybe just for a moment if he'd gotten a fair deal. That's the real tragedy. Not that we can't know if it was worth it, but that Sam probably knew it wasn't, and he did it anyway. Because once you've made the house your symbol, once you've built your entire identity around that choice, you can't unmake it. You're stuck. You're committed. You've invested too much to change course now. The house owns you as much as you own it, maybe more. And so Sam Walton lived and died in that house on 5th Street in Bentonville, Arkansas. A great man, a complicated man, a tragic man. And his house, that modest brick structure that was supposed to prove how unchanged he was by success, stands as the ultimate proof of exactly the opposite. It shows how completely he was consumed by his own mythology, trapped by his own choices, unable to escape the prison he'd built for himself, brick by modest brick. That's the story. That's the tragedy. One house, one man, one life spent proving a point that maybe didn't need proving. And in the end, an empty building that represents everything about the American dream that we don't like to talk about. The cost, the sacrifice, the things we give up in pursuit of success that we can never get back. The house is still there. You can drive by it any time. It looks like any other house. And maybe that's the most tragic thing of all.